Our next speaker is the Honorable former MP Batchimeg, who's currently serving as the director of the Ulaanbaatar Center for Policy Studies. She's published a number of books on China and Russia and is an expert on the Mongolian Constitution, among other topics. Since we're running a little bit behind schedule, I think I'm going to make an executive decision, and we're going to move our break up until right after Professor Batchimeg's talk, and then we'll come back to Professor Bedeski afterwards and finish up with our other Mongolian guests. And so if any of you are a little tired or flagging in the afternoon or flew all night in a magical trip here in 1 hour, we can promise you a cup of coffee in another 10 or 15 minutes.
So thank you very much for organizing for this important panel. I think the topic is very interesting, especially concerning the growing discourse about global recession of democracy. So it's important to recall about the value of Asia's democratic revolution and revolt. They remind us the meaning of these events and the importance of democracy and human rights movements in Asia and also elsewhere in the world. So I also thank you for having me this important panel, and I also especially thank for Dr. O'Brien and also Dr. Orna and our friends at the Institute for East Asian Studies for supporting Mongolia Initiative here at Berkeley. And it's very valuable work you are doing here. And I think we also, Mongolians, owe a lot to you to support your wonderful job here. So thank you again for that. And my discussion will be more about, of course, I will little continuation of what Mendee just talked about. I will briefly touch upon immediate successes of democratic revolt, and then briefly about new constitution of Mongolia and success and challenges we have today in Mongolia. Okay, Mendee just described very clearly about the pictures, what we have been through in the beginning of 1990s. I was about similar age with Mendee, so I was high school graduate student at 1990, so I have only some distant memories of that time. But I think Mr. Bolt can share you a lot of personal history about these movements, because he was right at the center of this movement, and he has a lot of personal struggles and memories of this event. So later we will have another very colorful stories to hear from him. And just briefly touching some historical events after 1990. In February 28, the very first Democratic Party of Mongolia was announced its establishment. And just a week after that, in early March, democratic freedom fighters, we call them partisan now. Perhaps you don't understand that word in English, but that's partisan. Veterans, okay. Veterans of democratic movements. They began their hunger strike in early March. Just after a few days, not less than 2 weeks, in March 10th of 1990, the Politburo of MPRP, a Communist Party, announced its resignation in mass. That was a very important event. And then in May 1990, our People's Congress adopted the law on constitutional amendment in May. That was a very important law because it was kind of transitional constitution at that time. And in this law, the one-party system was abolished. Multi-party system was adopted by this new amendment. And also a very important part was that it was recognized, the free election was recognized by this amendment. So We had very first democratic election in July 1990, thanks to this amendment. And then the first free democratic election was held in July, and then the bicameral parliamentary system was adopted in Mongolia in September 1990. Then we had this bicameral system for about less than 2 years, and new constitution of Mongolia was adopted in January 1992. These are important milestone events occurred after democratic revolution in 1990. Okay, then I want to say a few words about the importance of new constitution of Mongolia. Because this constitution is very, very important for modern Mongolia. Mongolia has Mongolia adopted its very first constitution in 1924. So we have less than 100 years of constitutional state, but the constitution of 1992, the new democratic constitution, gave Mongolians the opportunity, opportunity to be a real democratic state. This constitution enshrined very, very important democratic principles in it. And first, of course, human rights protection. We had constitution for about 70 years before this constitution, but it was the first time true human rights principles were enshrined in the nation's constitution for the first time in 1992. And then, of course, without proper separation of power, the human rights protection is impossible. So separation of powers, the principles of separation of powers were enshrined in this constitution. The legislative, executive, and judiciary branches of your government were established, and of course powers were divided into three branches. And also powers of central and provincial governments were also separated according to this constitution. And Mongolia became parliamentary state after having this new constitution. These are the core achievements and importance of our new democratic constitution. Okay, Mongolia is considered being one of the successful countries that consolidated democracy after 1990s. Not only in Asia, also among the post-communist countries, Mongolia is considered one of the successful states in terms of democratic consolidation. Of course, we can say a lot about this. First, let me say that the implementation of democratic constitution should be considered one of the factors that show the success of the democratization. We have very active constitutional court in Mongolia. Of course, life is never without any struggle, and we have a lot of debates in the country that criticizing constitutional court being politicized, etc. But generally speaking, democracy has been sustained and strengthened thanks to this constitution, and constitutional court has been the not only watchdog, it was a protector of the constitution, I would say. And then we had 7 consecutive parliamentary elections, general and local elections, also 6 presidential elections for the past 27 years, except for the 2008 elections. Mostly the elections were peaceful, and we had several times peaceful power transition in Mongolia. And we have growing private sector economy, and private sector now produces about 85% of the GDP of the nation. And Mongolia shifted from the rank of poor countries to middle country rank by the World Bank ranking. National income has been growing. And we have dynamic civil society in Mongolia. By 2013, more than 4,000 NGOs and also 86 international NGOs have been registered by the Ministry of Justice of Mongolia. Of course, if you discuss about quality of NGOs, we can discuss many things, but from the the numbers, you can see the growing dynamism of civil society in Mongolia. And then free media. According to the statistics provided by the Press Institution, by the end of 2015, we have 138 televisions, 111 newspapers, 90 magazines, and 92 news sites. We have only 3 million population. So, of course, the numbers are, why? This is a small market. But how can one country have so many media outlets? Of course, this is another discussion. But from the numbers, again, you can see another dynamism and opportunity of free speech in Mongolia. And then political competition is protected, accepted by law, and we have very open political competition. And by the end of 2016, we have 24 political parties registered by the Supreme Court of Mongolia. Okay, again, because time is limited, I will state only those numbers. Okay, besides these successes of democracy, we have a lot of challenges, perhaps growing challenges in Mongolia in terms of continuing consolidation of democracy. I want to state just a few figures again. Poverty is one of the core problems in the country. Poverty and income disparity is still existing and continually existing in Mongolia. Despite the fact that government has been, it has been the main agenda of every governments. Poverty remained still 22% of the population by the statistics of 2015, and reaches 20% of Mongolia consumes 30% of total national consumption, and poorest 20% of Mongolia consumes only about 7%. And we have, even though economy has been growing, but still we have a lot of economic challenges. Economy has been too much dependent on one sector, that's the mining sector. That means it's very much dependent on few exporting commodities and few markets outside. So that's economic vulnerability of Mongolia. And GDP has grown 17%, 17% in 2011, but only after 6 years. This year, the expected growth is perhaps around zero, minus and plus. You can see this clear fluctuations of economic situation, and for the past 2-3 years, the country has been facing a lot of economic difficulties. And one of the serious concerns that we have in the country is political instability. It's also one of the causes of economic instability in the country too. We had 15 cabinets in 27 years. That means average durability, average life of one cabinet is less than 2 years. When you have this political instability, it's very hard to think about, a very stable economic policy, very stable growth policy. So it's imaginable why the economy is so, unstable. And the governance and institutions are still weak. The most critical problem, I would say, is politicization of public service. I've read the story of public service of the United States until the Pendleton Act was adopted in late 19th century in the United States. It seems that you also had quite similar problem here in the States, like we are experiencing today. We have elections, general elections every 4 years, but very, very high public servants, high turnover of public service staff. So because of this politicization of public service, the quality of public service has been, decreasing seriously. Now we would say that public service spoil is a real situation in Mongolia. And corruption, again, it's a serious problem with regard to governance. And you can understand now why the support for democracy is decreasing in Mongolia. According to the recent survey by Sant Marl Foundation, people who responded that they would prefer dictatorship than democracy occupied 30.6%. Almost 30% of the total respondents in 2017. It was 28% in 2015. So the number is growing. People who disapprove of democratic regime is growing because of this corruption, because of this economic instability, because of poverty and the income disparity. And also government disapproval rate reached almost 50% in March 2017. So that means this weak governance and weak institutional development and gap of rich and poor, this income disparity are becoming main factor that becoming main threats to consolidation of democracy in Mongolia without addressing all these problems. Let me say a few words about the reason of this governance failure. Of course, there are many different reasons, but the core, and it's becoming common understanding, I would say, within the political arena and also among the scholars. Economic crisis is political, but not purely economic. That's the conclusion generally we are having in Mongolia. Just talked about the political factors and political situation within the country. And power is not separated in proper way among these three branches, especially between legislative and executive power, branches of the government. Parliament is holding too much power in Mongolia. Actually, scholars now say that Mongolia has super parliament system, like Weimar Germany had, or French Fourth Republic had in their history. Because there are two factors that guaranteeing the power, that giving power to executive branch of the government, or no matter it's corporate government. What gives power to CEO? That is, one is power of managing human resource, power of managing financial resource. But these two are now in Parliament's hand. Parliament holds these two powers, not the Prime Minister or executive branch. Our Parliament appoints all the ministers, not the prime ministers like in ordinary parliamentary states in Germany or Japan and other countries. And our Parliament also allocates budget in real life, not the Ministry of Finance or government really. Of course, we can allow the extended discussion on that, but that's very brief reflection on it. And then people now increasingly, again, according to the latest survey, 50% of the respondents say that government should play the leading role in solving problem, not the parliament. And then also, again, public service reform is needed. Without public service reform, it's now the situation is not in quite serious shape, and we also need political party reforms in order to have improvements in the institutions and institution building. And now we have, there is ongoing process of constitutional amendment in Mongolia. I can share some information later with you. So briefly speaking, now it's more and more people are coming to, becoming aware and coming to consensus that we should have constitutional amendment in order to bring improvements into the governance, and also we should have public service reform and political party reforms. These three are three very important steps to heal our governance situation in Mongolia. Okay, then we have uncertainties ahead to address. And first, I just briefly touched upon about ongoing constitutional amendment and public service reform. But constitutional amendment is very much controversial issue. We have now a supermajority in the parliament, even though the process has begun during the previous parliament when we had much more balanced power sharing in the parliament. But still, people are very much cautious about the process. So I personally believe it is necessary, but we have to be cautious about it. It's important to have a proper check and balance system to be adopted, by the constitution, but it's still very difficult. There is very difficult. There is a saying in Mongolia very difficult to translate into English. That just the meaning is that to be careful when you deal with your eyes. Just you have. So I believe you understand the meaning. So constitution is very important. It's important to bring improvements in it. But you have to be cautious. Don't, get things make worse. So that's the concern, and that you have a certain degree of uncertainty with regard to the constitutional amendment. And then another uncertainty and a very crucial factor for our democratization, further democratization, is, international context and global democratization. You know about the surroundings, international environment of Mongolia, and for us it's very much worrying to see that the global recession of democracy. I hope that the process will not continue for too long, perhaps in a decade or so, and again democratization will again get much broader support from the people of the different nation. And third, economic situation. If you don't have economic progress, and if you don't address the issue of poverty and income parity, the democracy will be again in danger in Mongolia. So we need to address those issues in order to strengthen democracy in Mongolia. Okay, thank you very much for your
attention. I was most struck by her mention of some figures related to civil society and the media for an area, a country that has the population that is half the population of the Bay Area, where we live right now. We do not have that level of vitality in the media or in civil society organizations or other things, very mean. So that really does speak to... I was also struck by the income disparity figures. Americans would kill for figures like that. Ours are so much worse than yours that that to me looks like a goal for the United States rather than reality. And then the last thing I was really struck by was the focus on institutional reform and how democratization, in the end, depends on institutions. It depends on constitutions, It depends on legal protections. It depends on election laws. And when we think about a place like China, we still talk about periods of fang and show, of closing and opening. There's some whim. We almost use the old kind of Maoist political language of political winds, where there's periods where things open up and then they close. But without those kind of institutional changes, those are all very precarious. And whatever difficulties Mongolia faces, at least you've passed through some of those institutional reforms that will make it difficult for some things to happen of the sort that can still happen quite easily in China. Okay, well, let's take a break for about 10 minutes. We will start promptly at 4 o'clock. Taught in Canada for a long time, and whose interest evolved toward all of East Asia and particularly Mongolia over the last several decades. He's the author of Human Security in the Chinese State, Historical Transformations and the Modern Quest for Sovereignty. And his topic has evolved a little bit since our schedule was made up. He's going to talk about something else that we hope will be of interest to you, that maybe will give us a little historical perspective on what we're doing. He's going to talk about the Mongolian origins of the Russian state.
It's a pleasure to be here, where I spent part of my undergraduate days and all of my graduate days. I was here in the 1960s, where there was also demonstrations, and some of the people at the time thought it was the mother of all demonstrations, but nothing like the life and death movements that went on in Korea, Mongolia, or China. So I've been interested in the formation of the state, the evolution of the nation state, since my days at Berkeley. I did my dissertation on the Kuomintang state building efforts in China, and have extended this project into other countries as well. And I became interested in Mongolia by a visit there in 1993, and wondering how Mongolia transformed from being a mover and a shaker in the medieval period into a kind of victim subsequently. How did this de-evolution take place? The Russian state formation has been extremely important in this development. Russian state formation itself was the product of at least 4 hinge events. The first was, of course, the Mongol conquest in 1237 to 1240. And then there was Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible's expansion into the Volga basin. A third hinge event was Peter I's westernization policy. And the fourth event was the civil war between the Reds and the Whites after the October Revolution of 1917. Each hinging event tightened government control over population and territory, reducing and excluding external interventions and monopolizing material and human resources for the state. Today, the Eurasian school of thought in Russia emphasizes the Asian character of Russian development, which began in the wake of the Mongol conquest. However, the Bolshevik Revolution, hardened in the fires of the Civil War, marked a historical departure from whatever Asian roots had survived and created a new type of sovereignty. It was the combination of Bolshevik revolution and war communism which inspired the template of state formation for Mongolia, Maoist China, Kim Il-sung's North Korea, Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam, and Pol Pot's Cambodia. The essence of that template was to maximize state sovereignty at the expense of citizen or subject life security. The Eurasianist persuasion in Russian history debates attempts to explain characteristics of the Russian state occupying a middle position between Western Europe and Asia. The paradigm begins with the Mongol conquest of Russia in the 13th century and its effect on state and society development. Mainstream historians consider Mongol impact mostly destructive, while Vernadsky and others of the Eurasianist persuasion find some positive features of the Mongol era which formed the Russian character. The Mongol conquest and occupation of lands which became the Russian state was an Asian intrusion into a Christian state and permanently affected development of Russians in their submission to nomadic warriors. Referring to the Eurasianist debate, the question is whether the Mongol conquest was a temporary setback or a major deflection of state progress. The Russian trauma of defeat and occupation by the Mongol hordes was removed when Kazan and other lands to the southeast were won and incorporated into Muscovy's realm from 1552. This opened the drive to the sea and eventual incorporation of Central Asia and Siberia into the Russian Empire. For Muscovy, subservience to Sarai, the seat of the Golden Horde, in military, diplomatic, and economic affairs was no longer necessary after the conquest of Kazan, and the weakened and diminished Khanates were unable to resist onslaughts of Ivan IV. He retained some of the Chinggisid protocols, claiming legitimacy as a descendant or a political descendant of the Khan power. Tamerlane's earlier invasion in the late 14th century introduced a serious disruption of commercial relations between Asia and Europe. A century later, European exploration and maritime development reduced traffic on overland routes. Central Asia, once a land version of the Mediterranean Sea as both barrier and highway, was succumbing to economic decline brought about by factors beyond anybody's control. In 1917, the Bolsheviks captured the Russian state, riding the wave of popular resistance to an unwinnable war, a hunger for bread, land, and peace as well. They were led by a disciplined and determined cadre and supported by an alliance of soldiers, workers, peasants, and intellectuals. The Bolshevik victory over the Whites in the Civil War gave them most of the old Russian Empire and also confirmed their sense of besiegement by foreign powers, resistance in the Ukraine, and continued counter-revolutionary elements within the state. Such lessons strengthened totalitarian proclivities in subsequent years. There was Allied assistance to the white forces, that is the anti-Bolshevik forces, indicating their opposition to the revolution. Finland and Baltic republics broke away. This all points to a conundrum of the state. In the 20th century, Asian elites abandoned traditional state forms and sought to recreate either a liberal or a Bolshevik state in their own country. In China, Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek led bourgeois revolutions based on a program of military unification and democratization, followed by economic development and integration into global markets. It was the path blazed by Japan in the Meiji Restoration. The other route of development was inspired by the Russian Revolution and its instrument of a highly disciplined Communist Party with radical program and adaptive ideology. The nationalist revolution might have succeeded if the international system of trade and commerce had not collided with protectionism and tariff walls, and had the Japanese not intervened and tried to force China into a subordinate and semi-colonial status. Expectations of continued prosperity and political order under the Western European umbrella did not materialize, and the Bolshevik model, adapted to China's peasant society and combined with appeals to anti-Japanese patriotism, fueled the success of Mao Zedong's guerrilla forces. During the nearly 3 decades after 1949, the Soviet model of proletariat dictatorship and imitations of war communism dominated the Chinese approach to state building. Soviet central planning was rejected as the Chinese communists became more radical. Mao's death and Deng Xiaoping's reforms marked partial departure from the Bolshevik template. The high point of Soviet Bolshevik influence in Asia occurred during the 1960s. Variations of war communism occurred in Mongolia, China, Vietnam, and North Korea, adapted to their predominantly rural societies. However, communist movements in East Asia misread the lessons of Bolshevism. It was most successful as a state-building enterprise, creating a new sovereignty for its subjects by making war on those who either opposed or failed to support. To summarize, ample evidence for an early Asianized Russian state can be derived from the hinge events of Mongol conquest and Ivan IV's thrust into the Volga region. In the 18th century, initiated by Peter I's window to the west, the Russian Empire ruled lands as far as the Pacific and became part of the European state system. The 1917 revolution and subsequent civil war were a departure from Russian history and a creative new phase that provided a model of state building for parts of Asia. That model has proven its limitations, and now those states, except for North Korea, have incorporated elements of capitalism into their economies, but stopped short of granting democratic citizenship to their subjects. Bolshevism and war communism pointed the way to achieving sovereignty, but at the expense of equal life security. Some are more equal than others. The Mongol conquest and occupation of Rus was the high tide of Asianization. Ivan IV's capture of Kazan and expansion to the Caspian Sea was a military counterattack against the Asiatic state, but was accompanied by incorporation of some of its features. Russian inversion of Asianization occurred in the 20th century as Bolshevik war communism's policy of terrorism, repression of resistance, secret police, control of economy, and forced and food confiscation were adapted in post-war communist regimes. Sponsorship and success of communist takeovers in parts of Asia convinced Lenin's heirs that the chief Russian product was communist revolution and a highly centralized state. This export could transform Asian societies according to the Bolshevik template. Moreover, global organization of national communist parties demonstrated the market for the Soviet model of political action. The imposition of Soviet hegemony on countries of the cordon sanitaire was more successful than in Asia in terms of integrating economies and armies with Moscow. By the time of Gorbachev, the defects of the Soviet system were plain for all to see, and the Chinese market reforms under communist rule offered an alternative model for the other communist states. In conclusion, the Bolshevik Revolution and its offspring in war communism established the sovereignty of the Soviet state. It created a pattern for East Asia. However, it diminished old liberties in exchange for greater life security under the new sovereignty. With regard to Eurasianist theory, the Civil War and its aftermath began an era of Euro rejection in Russia and of an experiment in political Russification in selected Asian countries, especially in Mongolia. The experiment failed, but its effects are still visible in one-party states. Passive Eurasianism was followed by active Russification abroad. Rejection by East Asia and dissolution of the Soviet Union may have stimulated Moscow to enter a new era of state consolidation under Putin. Here we have hegemony over the Ukraine and Crimea and primacy over the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. So I wonder if Putin is the leader who will reconcile the Russian red with the white, creating a post-Soviet era in a shade of pink. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next talk will be by the Honorable MP Lou Bold. He was one of the leaders of the Democratic Revolution of Mongolia in 1990 when he was in charge of the Mongolian Student Union. He was elected to the first parliamentary elections in 1990 and then later served as both the foreign minister and the defense minister of Mongolia. So.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. It was a really kind invitation to me to be here, and I thank the East Asia Studies of the University of California, Berkeley, for this leadership in taking the Mongolian studies. And also I thank Asia Foundation from the beginning of democratic changes in Mongolia, supporting us, supporting Mongolia. and also all our friends and institutions who have been with us all these difficult years. Yes, today I wanted to speak about the Mongolian democracy, its fate, Mongolian constitution, which was one of the reasons that we convened today's conference. I think after 27 years of real turbulent developments we had, it is a time to reconsider, to evaluate where we have gone, what we have achieved, and what's next. And as one of the active participants of the democratic revolution, of course, I could share with you also some personal insights at that time. I should say, when we went on the square, central square, first time and maybe the single time when in Mongolian history so many thousands, 100,000 people gathered, we felt this responsibility, and it was a real life and death story at that time. And when the leaders at that time gave up, Politburo resigned, and suddenly we were standing there as winners. But at the same time, many of us thought we have been betrayed, because we wanted to fight. We wanted a real battle in order to be satisfied. We live or we die. But suddenly, not a single window broken, not a single life spent, and it's considered that we won, you know. Someone spoke about the unfinished revolution in Korea. That was really our thinking. This revolution is unfinished, and we were really struggling what to do next. But by the time when we adopted the new constitution, first time we realized that this democratic constitution gave us the first feeling, yes, we have accomplished. The constitution is adopted. We couldn't believe, you know. It's incorporated all the values of the democratic society. That was a real wonder to us. We accomplished first democratic elections. In 1996, when first time the very young democratic parties in a landslide victory won the parliamentary election, that was a real big surprise, not only to us, but to the entire world. And since then, after 25 years of democratic revolution, some 2 years ago, we were sitting together with many of our parliament members, our friends, including Honorable Batchimeg. And that time, we outlined now to preserve Mongolia's democracy, what we have to do. Where is our strength, and where is our next frontier? And we outlined some 10 values. We consider that we have to outline where is our values and to protect them. That was our decision 2 years ago. And since that time, we started the Mongolia Democracy Initiative, which aimed to preserve, to educate, and to protect those values. Those include really very understandable issues. Like I could name the most important of those. The most significant value of Mongolia's democracy was this consensus building and peaceful solution, as I told you just now. That was that time for us. It was really something which made us unhappy. But now, the time we realize how it is important for the future to preserve democracy. That in the beginning it ends in a peaceful solution. Then, secondly, of course, democracy is something new. Everyone recognized that, especially to this part of the world. But the Mongolia's democracy, one of most important values, it was nurtured on with their own culture. As a nomadic society, we Mongolians really are carriers of democratic society, democratic decision-making, because it is really our way of life. Therefore, today there has been a lot of different studies, but if you study very closely, Mongolia's democratic revolution was not kind of those colored revolutions you have in many Eastern European countries, or those Arab Spring type process which you had in many countries. It was really arising from itself, based on national values. And that was a really important value we have to protect and to continue. Again, it was always said, everyone recognized, it was a courageous revolution. Because usually in many countries, especially in the region, it is obvious that to implement political and economic transitions simultaneously, it is a big challenge. It is a long way at the very end. We recognize that after 27 years. But I think we save, in the long run, much more time and effort and lives as many other countries which have faced same situations. Then today also we spoke, one of most important values of Mongolian democracy is the freedom of expression. That's the real spirit of Mongolian democracy. You all have seen how people cherish that right. Of course, one of the first laws when the Democratic Party first came in power more than 20 years ago, it was to prohibit the government to own and have any mass media outlets, any newspapers, TV stations, and so on. But that was not enough, as we see today. Now it is privatized, and again, there is always the danger it can be manipulated. But the technological development of today, the existence of new media and social media, it gives a real replacement, real support in Mongolia to protect this very important value. If you see, Mongolia's population is 3 million. And if you see the Facebook and Twitter users, it's also, I think, about 3 million. So, means everyone already active social media users. And that's the real guarantee that freedom of expression will be continuing in future. Also, we spoke today about the people's support for democracy. Yes, there is a global trend. People want strong hands. And Honorable Batchimeg also told the recent polls that some 30% support now the dictatorship. But 2 weeks ago I visited France, and they had also some presentations. In France it is 70%. In US, I think, seeing the current president, it's more than 50%, right? The vote shows, At the same time, any polls you conduct in those 27 years, more than 90% of people always, also today, say that the transition to democracy in 1990 was the right thing. Nobody doubted it. Nearly nobody. That's a real strength of Mongolia's democracy. Because The previous speaker spoke about Russia, Mongolia, this connection. 20th century, it was century of Mongolia's independence. We chose communism because there was no other choice, and because with this choice, our de jure independence came into effect. But we chose democracy because our de facto independence comes into effect. And Mongolians will never, never regret or take a step back from that achievement. Therefore, support for democracy is for Mongolia unchangeable. That I have to say. And another value of democracy, which we want to revive again, to make sure for future generations that democracy is staying on in Mongolia. It was a democracy carried on by young people. That time I was in my 20s, and I was one of the oldest in this group, you know. And if you see any other revolution, always old people design, develop, lead, and support. But in case of Mongolia, again, Mongolia is a young population, but in Mongolia's case, it was the young people. Nobody teach us, nobody lead us. We came as real representatives of our people and struggled for the new values and democracy. Also, we spoke about the active NGOs and activity of citizens. This is also our greatest value, the pluralism. That was from the beginning something we have always cherished, and that you can see how many NGOs and other civic groups and initiatives arising. That's showing the strength and continuity of our important future development of Mongolian democracy. And this pluralism also shows, as a reward for our Communist Party, that it didn't use force, it was allowed to stay and continue. From one side, people said, that's impossible. Any other country, if there is democratic revolution, this party representing the dictatorship was dissolved. But in case of Mongolia, we decided we better compete with that party. At the same time, that gave us the higher standards for new parties to develop itself, to stand up as a real force. It's like in a boxing match, you know. If you punch above your weight, you are more skilled. And that was true for new Mongolian parties. If you see today, now we have more members, now we have more experience in government than all former Communist Party which ruled more than 70 years without competition, and gained the system and experience and money and property, everything. We had nothing. We started zero, but today we became the strongest political force. Of course, time to time, it's always differently who wins the elections. But still, in the hearts of people, involving the broad masses of population, the democratic parties have really achieved, in this short period of time, a remarkable success. Then, another value I have to outline. It was, as also was outlined by previous speakers, that we could define and protect political, social, economic rights and freedoms of individuals, made our citizens powerful. That was learning your experience. Today I am representing maybe one of the youngest and smallest by population democracies in the world. Speaking here to the people of one of the oldest and biggest democracies. But what made America so strong? Because the people of America made strong by its constitution, by its system. That was a great example for us, which really, there's no boundary to implement this. And of course, important value for our democracy is how to educate our people. If you go to Mongolia, it's really like we always lived in democracy. You know, everyone is so done with those rights. You know, do just something wrong, you know, and people's answer will be really overwhelming. You know. That is a very important value we have to protect in future. And here we wanted to talk about the challenges. Honorable Batchimeg had told most of important things. I only want to add, present government where again the former ruling party won the most seats, but overwhelming majority. Of course, there are some setbacks, especially in the judiciary system. They, again, creating the military system like we had in a socialist time. There has been a lot of dangers for human rights, for rights of individuals. It means that still we have to continue our fight to make sure that there will be no setback. One thing is clear: securing the pluralism of views and openness and securing the elections. If you see the 7 parliamentary elections in the last 27 years, there was not a single time when the ruling party won the elections. Every election meant change of power from one to another. That is a real guarantee, I think, for future, to make sure that the rulers know that tomorrow they will be on the street. You know. And that's one thing we have to bear in mind and continue. And today, we see here the Mongolia Initiative. Last week, I went to Washington, D.C. on my another capacity as a founder and president of the New Mongolia Initiative. This initiative, you can go on the newmongoliainitiative.org, our website, get more information because I don't want to talk too extensively. But this initiative is about not only securing Mongolia and Mongolia's democracy, but securing overall new development in the region, where Mongolia can really play a crucial role, like we played in the past. That there was times we were fighting internally. It was a weak nation. Genghis Khan came and said, why we don't unite and conquer the world? And they nearly achieved that goal. No? And today, our idea is, why there's so much fighting around us, everywhere? No? Why all the people of the world not unite and conquer the universe? You know? Let's define a new great goal so that there will be no room for us to fight each other. You know? It's the example of Genghis Khan and Mongolia's development. I think that's a very important time, because until now, yes, there has been different economic situations, but we saw our opportunities, our strength in mining resources. But recent development showed us that's not enough. That's not what we want, what we need. Mongolia having a population nearly 70% younger than 35 years, and such a great potential of talent. We should go from mining the resources to mining the opportunities. And those opportunities, we have really a lot, bringing Mongolia again as an important platform for regional cooperation, for global cooperation. And last week, we had very, very good meetings in Washington, also with the Democratic leader, Nancy Pelosi, who represents San Francisco, and she promised to support our idea. Mongolia's educational reform, Mongolia becoming a new Silicon Valley in Asia. Because Silicon Valley is not about buildings or infrastructure, not only. It is about freedom. It is about innovation. And that is something where Mongolia could play a crucial role. Also, we had a very good event with one of the first two men to land on moon, the legend Buzz Aldrin, about supporting these space programs in Mongolia. You can go his Twitter account. He just a few days ago also tweeted about the opportunities. That my friend Andreas, he took photos and gave me today, and I want to show you, some of the photos. This is the most famous picture of astronaut on moon. That's Buzz Aldrin, and this is him himself, together with me, And we were talking about Mongolia's opportunity. Because today we have only few people. In Washington it was full house, So everyone supported it, We were talking about opportunities, how we can develop Mongolia as a new hub for this development. Therefore, I think it is a time for big dreams, for big future, for more peace, and that is more prosperity and more democracy for everyone. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very uplifting talk. It's always interesting as a student of protest to hear from protesters, and I learn something new every time. The one I learned this time is that the victory in Mongolia was too easy. You wanted a fight, you didn't get the fight, you were expecting it, and then they just gave in. And that really runs against the grain of the way we think about protesters sometimes. But when you think about young people, that's not surprising at all. You came, you wanted to win a little tougher fight with some real effort, and next thing you know, it was yours. So that was interesting. There are also interesting things to hear about your later career as a man who's devoted his life to politics, about the nomadic origins of the democratic ways of thinking that are inherent in a nomadic lifestyle that gave you an opportunity to build democracy in a place where you might not have expected democracy. And then the other thing that really caught my attention was about public opinion, saying that 30% of Mongolians are in favor of dictatorship is not actually that bad. Sitting here in the United States right now, I sit there thinking all the time, would I prefer Xi Jinping to be my president or Donald Trump? And then I think about it seriously, and I say, no, do I really mean that? So people say things like that, and people they think they believe things like that, but do they really believe things like that? And when 90% of people still say they're very glad democratization in Mongolia took place, I think that means something just as important as 30% say they are in favor of dictatorship. And then your last point about getting together for the space program, as you were talking about coming up with a common goal for the whole world to pursue. I'm not sure if anything short of alien invasion will bring us all together to pursue world peace, but we can hope for it, and it's fascinating to think that Mongolia could be part of the space future of our universe. Okay, we'll turn on to our last speaker, Steve Fish, a colleague of mine in the political science department. He's a reformed Soviet specialist who worked on the early stirrings of democracy in Russia, and has also worked in Indonesia, and more recently has turned his interest to Mongolia, where he's looked at questions like Mongolian constitutions and other issues. He's also written on the resource curse, which is an issue of great importance to a place like Mongolia. In fact, I think you have a new article out in Journal of Democracy I was just going through on Mongolia in the last issue or two. So if you haven't had a chance to see the latest update on what American scholars are thinking about Mongolian democracy and constitutions and politics, you'll get to hear it from Steve right now.
Great, thank you. It's a real honor to be able to speak here. There are several of my heroes here. They don't know they're my heroes, but I'm as an avid student of Mongolian democratization, albeit not a big expert on it. It's especially an honor to be here with Mr. Bold, Ms. Batchimeg. These are, makers of the Mongolian democratic experiment. I just want to say that, the Mongolian democratic experiment is of great international importance. This is a developing country that has shown that it can actually, in a region that actually has very little democracy at all, really no hint of it in other lands of the former Soviet Union. And many people think of Mongolia, of course, as having been the 16th republic of the Soviet Union. To have democracy actually work in Mongolia is a very big deal, and it has a big demonstration effect around the world. And it's all the more remarkable, of course, because Mongolia had no structural advantages when it came to democratization. It's in a terrible neighborhood sandwiched between two of the Neanderthals of world politics, China and Russia. Also, it was a relatively poor country, a country with a Soviet legacy. Democracy, in some sense, never really had a chance in Mongolia, and yet it succeeded anyway. The recent parliamentary elections, of course, in 2016, reaffirmed Mongolia's democratic status. They were free and fair. From my perspective as a comparativist who is not a specialist in Mongolia per se, and who's attracted to Mongolia just because it's a case of something interesting that fascinates me, it strikes me that there are a couple of things that are especially important to sustain Mongolian democracy. One is good institutions. The country really chose well when it came to its mixed kind of parliamentary presidential system, heavy on parliamentary powers, but still with a president that has a real veto. It takes 2/3 to override his veto. So, of course, when he vetoes something, it actually matters. The presidency also has a great deal of authority over judicial appointments, as everybody knows. The strong civil society that Mongolia's evolved as well, in my opinion, is probably the most important thing. I've never quite understood how Mongolia got this remarkably vibrant civil society, but this is what strikes me as being perhaps the most important factor in sustaining Mongolian democratization. I think about organizations that go back to Alexis de Tocqueville's kind of schema on how civil society aids democracy. Civil society organizations can check and monitor state power. Easy to find those in Mongolia. Globe International, for example, which has pushed for greater public access to information on government operations, assisting the state. State civil society relations need not always be contentious or they need not work in opposition to each other. You think about the Mongolian National Federation for the Blind, which has helped to write and push legislation that advances the interests of the disabled, has actually created its own enterprises also that employs the blind and partly sighted, organizations that push back against powerful societal interests. Another thing Tocqueville flagged in his kind of typology of why, or the kind of reasons why civil society tends to be good for democracy when it's strong. Think about the united movement of Mongolian rivers and lakes, which has scored victories on behalf of Mongolia's nomadic peoples, even against large mining companies. You don't see that too often, where scrappy little organizations made up of impecunious people score big victories against big corporations. Anywhere in the world, Mongolia actually, we do have an example of that. Articulating and pressing social demands. I think about the National Center Against Violence, the Mongolian Women Lawyers Association, and the NGO whose name I love the best of any I've ever heard of in the world, the Liberal Women's Brain Pool, coming together and pooling their efforts and pushing for legislation, goes back to 2004, that fought domestic violence in a big way. This at a time when Russia is actually just adopted earlier this year, legislation that softens penalties for domestic abuse, this being part of Putin's kind of macho effort to reassert Russia as a bastion of traditional values. Now you get one free blow if you're a man against your partner at home, if you like, without being liable to criminal prosecution, in a remarkable step backwards in a country that's taking a lot of steps backwards right now. But I'd like to actually just also flag what I view as the big threats to Mongolian democracy, because while I see it as really one of the world's most remarkable democratic experiments, I also think it's in danger right now. And I'd just like to mention a few reasons why. The first is the retreat of the United States from support for global democracy. The current administration has absolutely no interest in promoting democracy in the United States, much less abroad. It is openly hostile to democracy support in the world. I think we have to concur that aggressive, culturally insensitive promotion of democracy by the United States government in countries whose people do not want the quote-unquote help, like China and like Egypt, perhaps like Russia as well, might be inappropriate. But in a country like Mongolia, whose people actually do profit from, and for the most part want, the help in building democratic institutions, for the United States, the world's leading democratic power, to be in retreat from democracy promotion in the world bodes bad things, not only for Mongolian democracy, but other democracies in the world that receive a lot of American support. And here, the most important thing is not even financial support, it's moral support. The United States has been an anchor supporting democracy in the world for as long as anybody can remember. That seems to perhaps no longer be the case. I was heartened to hear Mr. Bohl talk about the meeting with Nancy Pelosi. We can only hope that these efforts to continue helping Mongolian democracy continue under the administration's radar, that somehow Congress can keep these programs going. I fear, though, that with big cuts coming to the State Department, perhaps coming to the State Department, that these kinds of programs could be in trouble. We'll see about that. I'm also concerned about, of course, about Russian imperialism and the rising anti-democratic sentiment in Russia. The thing to remember here is that Putin is allergic to democracy in his neighborhood. We all know this. This is part of why he works so assiduously to undermine democracy in Ukraine. Isn't all that hard to do in Ukraine. In Mongolia, it's actually much harder to do unless he wants to really intervene in a more direct way. But it's clear that the Russian government is already siding with, supporting, bribing parliamentarians, big mining interests on behalf of its own agenda, which is anything but democratic. Russia's interest in undermining democracy around the world, and in fact its formation of what might be called a kind of anti-democratic international or an autocracy international in recent years, is a big problem for Mongolia potentially. Mongolia has done a good job historically, at least in the last century or so, of balancing Russian and Chinese interests in its own country. During the 1990s, though, Mongolia, I think, benefited from kind of benign neglect on the part of the big powers. Now, with so much money to be made in mining, the Russian government is back in it, supporting its mining companies, but more than that, trying to undermine democracy around the world. I think that could become a very big problem, especially as some politicians in Mongolia prove amenable to Russian enticement. The autocratic tendency in China, of course, China was never a democracy in this century, but at the same time, we can talk about, and this was discussed in earlier presentations, the movement back since 2012 toward an even harder autocracy. This does not bode well for democracy in Mongolia. It doesn't necessarily bury it, but it's certainly the two countries that sandwich Mongolia, neither one of them are becoming more democratic. And one of them in particular, which is Russia, has a true kind of global anti-democratic agenda, and it's willing to use pretty much any means necessary to realize that. I'm also concerned about economic difficulties and increasing Chinese involvement. With the economy having grown, as was pointed out earlier, by 17% in 2011, but now with the price of commodities going down or having gone down in the last few years, there's a lot of slack in the economy. Unemployment is risen again. This kind of thing opens up all kinds of opportunities, and really, for the Chinese government to offer to substitute for Western aid, which seems to oftentimes not be as readily forthcoming, and this could come with strings attached. A lot of people in Mongolia who I've spoken with kind of find this enticing. At the same time, of course, I think everybody is aware that it could come with strings attached. I'm also concerned, as everybody is, of course, with what looks like the decline in popular support for democracy in Mongolia. The fact that 30% of the people, and they didn't say they were in favor of dictatorship in that survey, they said they liked the idea of a strong hand in politics or something like that. You can get similar numbers for the United States, Great Britain, and other countries as well. That isn't all that alarming to me. What I find alarming, based on the Russian experience, is the possibility that the intractability of corruption is going to turn ordinary people off to democracy. What happened in Russia was that in the 1990s, as far as I read it, and I lived in Russia during a good deal of the 1990s, ordinary folks decided that democracy wasn't doing them all that much good. And the main reason was that corruption was completely out of control. They said that, if this is what democracy gets us, as a predatory elite, who needs it? Now, in Mongolia, the same thing could happen. And going back to Russia, by the time that Putin came along, 1999, 2000, a guy who said, essentially, I'm no Democrat, but I'll pull down the oligarchs and bring some justice to Russia, most people were ready to applaud. That sounded good to a lot of Russians. My fear in the Mongolian case is that if these problems of corruption are not really attacked in a very serious way, and if liberal parliamentarians don't quit taking bribes, that this is actually going to become a very serious issue, and a large part of ordinary people in Mongolia are actually going to start saying, if this is what democracy gets us, perhaps it's not doing all that much good at all. I'm also concerned about the possible weaknesses in the elite consensus on democracy. This is actually much more important than popular opinion. Elites in any country are going to make the policy, they're going to set the tone for public opinion. And what I see happening in Mongolia recently, and I haven't been there since 2012, but I could already see it then, is the rise of, within the MPP, within the Mongolian People's Party, not so much among the Democratic Party stalwarts, but the existence, I think it's undeniable, and our Mongolian guests, of course, know about this, of a very substantial faction of the party, some of whom are in power right now and hold ministerial positions, who really admire Putinism and who really themselves aren't that sure about Mongolian democracy. They're not calling for a dictatorship, but they actually do like the idea, for example, of a great deal of shifting power, in large part, to the presidency in Mongolia. Now, I know that you've got constitutional reforms on the agenda, but I want to, as a comparativist, lodge the following caveat about any enthusiasm for moving power from the parliament to the presidency. Batchimeg made the point that parliament seems to maybe in some ways be too powerful in Mongolia, and I see that case. On the other hand, I disagree with that. I think that every country that's moved authority from its parliament to its president ends up losing its democracy. This is just universal. This is what happens. In every post-Soviet country, Eastern European country that vested a lot of power in its initial constitution in the presidency, much more than in the parliament, democratization has subsequently failed miserably. This is universal. And if you get outside the post-communist world as well, what you see is overweening chief executives, even if democratically elected, are democracy's greatest antagonist over the last 40 years or so. There's no greater antagonist, not popular uprisings, not populism, not military, not men in epaulets staging military coup. It is elected presidents, not wild-eyed people in the streets, people wearing ties. It's ordinary elected presidents who become a very strong threat to democracy. Now, I can understand that members of the Democratic Party now and advocates of democracy would favor moving power to the executive in hopes, of course, that the Democratic Party wins the elections, and the presidential elections in this coming summer's elections. On the other hand, I think it's very important to remember that, first of all, the Democratic Party might not win the elections, and second of all, even if it does, the president already has enough to push back. His veto power and his control over the judiciary already give him enough power to push back against Parliament. If you transfer yet more power to the presidency, I fear that the Mongolian democracy could be in danger. I think about 10 years ago, and before that, even 5 years ago, most Democrats were on board with maintaining a very strong parliament. Now I hear a lot of people saying, well, maybe we need a strong president. Keep in mind, though, and a lot of people are simply unaware of this, that the presidency, and a lot of people look to the United States and say, we want to be like the United States. The United States has an extraordinarily strong legislature. In fact, the United States and Mongolia both have very strong legislatures. The American president has a little more power than the Mongolian president, but not that much more power. And the whole idea of creating a strong executive presidency, where the president initiates legislation, can make decrees, controls the agencies of coercion himself, and so on, which I know are possible and popular even among some Mongolian Democrats today, hold the greatest danger for Mongolian democracy. I would think twice, and I think 3 or 4 or 100 times before supporting constitutional amendments that move power in any big way into the presidency. Now, a finer balance of power that includes perhaps some movement of power from the parliament to the presidency might be appropriate, but I'm very concerned with this enthusiasm that I see, even among some Mongolian Democrats now, for a presidential system. I think this is poison for Mongolia and would be a very big problem. Okay? Let me wrap up there. Thanks a lot.